The cab stopped in front of my house at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The driver, a young man with an earring in his ear, turned around and gave me a sympathetic look. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I shook my head negatively. I'm 68, but I'm still proud, too proud for my age and situation. Clinging to the car door, I slowly climbed out, trying not to disturb my operated knee. 3 days at St. Catherine's Hospital in Lovell seemed like an eternity. I couldn't wait to be home, in my old armchair with a cup of real tea, not the stuff they served at the hospital. "Are you sure you can handle it?" The driver was still hesitant, looking at my crutches and pale face. "My grandson has to meet me," I lied, though Lance didn't know anything about my discharge. Cassidy had insisted I not bother the boy during exams. Well, my sister-in-law had promised to meet me herself, but her car was nowhere to be seen. I paid, adding a modest tip. My meager savings didn't allow for much more, and the cab drove off, leaving me alone with the pain in my knee and the heavy crutches I hadn't yet gotten used to. My house looked the same as ever. 2 stories, white, with dark blue shutters, and a small garden I'd planted with my own hands 30 years ago. Nate, my son, grew up in this house. He brought his bride, Cassidy, a thin blonde with eyes the color of stormy skies, here. This is where Lance was born. And this was where Nate had died of a sudden brain aneurysm in the upstairs bedroom 2 years ago, so quickly that no one had had time to do anything about it. I waddled slowly down the walkway, thinking about the hot bath and the painkillers Dr. Schumann had prescribed me. The pain was getting worse with each step. I was surprised Cassidy hadn't come out to meet me. Maybe she didn't hear the cab pull up. I was almost to the porch when I spotted him. My old suitcase, shabby, brown, corners peeling. The same one my late husband Jack and I had once used on our wedding trip to Niagara. The suitcase stood by the door, neatly closed, with the sleeve of my blue sweater sticking out from under the lid. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped, leaning on my crutches, unable to believe my eyes. A white envelope lay on the suitcase. I bent over, writhing in pain, and picked it up with trembling fingers. "It's just the three of us now. Find another place to sleep. Your sister-in-law." I reread the note twice, then again. The letters blurred before my eyes. This couldn't be happening. Cassidy couldn't have done this. I put my palm against the glass of the front door and peered inside. They were in the living room, Cassidy and some man, tall with reddish hair gathered in a ponytail. I'd never seen him before. They were standing close together, too close. The man was holding a glass one of my crystal wine glasses, a wedding gift to Jack and me from his parents. "Cassidy," I knocked on the door. "Cassidy, what's going on?" They turned around. The man frowned, and my daughter-in-law, the mother of my only grandson, my late son's wife, looked at me with such an icy expression that I shuddered. "Cassidy, open the door." I pounded harder, feeling panic rising from within. "What does this note mean? What's going on?" The man said something to her, and she nodded. Then she went to the door, but didn't open it, only brought her face closer to the glass. "Muriel." Her voice was muffled through the glass, but I could hear every word as clear as the sound of a hammer. "We've talked it over. You can't live here anymore. After the operation, you need special care that we can't provide." "But this is my home." I didn't recognize my own voice, high and trembling. "This house belongs to me. You can't kick me out." The corner of her mouth twitched. "Actually, I can. Check the papers you signed at the hospital if you don't believe me." "What papers?" I tried to remember. There was so much paperwork at the hospital. Insurance forms, consent forms for surgery, some paperwork Cassidy had brought me, saying it was to pay for treatment. "I didn't sign anything about the house." "You signed a power of attorney," she said slowly, as if explaining it to a child. Comprehensive. And now, according to the doctor's recommendations, you should be in a specialized institution. Lance? I clung to the thought like a lifeline. Where's Lance? I want to talk to my grandson. He's at practice, Cassidy cut him off. And we've already explained the situation to him. He understands that it's best for everyone. The man walked over and stood beside her, putting his hand on her shoulder. Familial, possessive. Mrs. Brody. His voice was low, slightly husky. We can get you a cab to the social center. They can help you get into a suitable nursing home. Your things are already packed. Who are you? I felt tears come to my eyes, but I pushed them back. I won't cry, not in front of them. Fletch Doggart. He tilted his head slightly. Friend of the family. We don't have friends with that name. We do now. Cassidy smiled at him, then turned her gaze back to me. Muriel, please don't make this any harder than it has to be. We can call the police if you insist, but it would be unpleasant for everyone. The police? I gasped with indignation. For wanting to enter my own home? For trespassing. Fletch clarified with fake regret in his voice. We'd already changed the locks for security. I pulled on the doorknob, not believing my ears. The door wouldn't budge. The lock was indeed different. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. They'd planned the whole thing, waiting for me to be in the hospital, maybe even timed the surgery, since Cassidy had insisted I not put it off any longer. Panic swept over me. I leaned against the wall of the house, trying to calm my breathing. What to do? Where to go? I barely had any money on me, just my card and some cash I'd taken to the hospital. The bank, I mumbled, fumbling for my cell phone in my pocket. I need to call the bank. I walked away from the door on stiff legs. The pain in my knee now seemed insignificant compared to the pain in my chest. Dropping my own suitcase with my own belongings in front of my own house, I dialed with trembling fingers the number of the Lovell First Bank, where I kept my modest savings. After a few beeps, a pleasant female voice answered, Lovell First Bank, how can I help you? My name is Muriel Brody. My voice sounded strangely calm. I would like to know the status of my accounts. The standard identification procedure followed. Account number, date of birth, mother's maiden name. Then the woman said, Just a moment, Mrs. Brody. I'll check. Pause, rustle of papers or keyboard. You have $96.35 left in your checking account. I almost dropped the phone. That's impossible. There must be about $12,000 in there. 1 second, let me check my transaction history. Yes, I see that $11,900 was withdrawn a week ago. The transaction was authorized by a trusted person, Cassidy Brody. A trustee? I got chills. According to our records, you executed a power of attorney for her on March 7th. The woman continued. It was properly notarized. March 7th, the day I went into the hospital, the day Cassidy brought me the insurance papers I'd signed as I lay on the gurney waiting for surgery. Thank you, I whispered, and disconnected before the operator's kind farewell. My house, my money, everything I had, everything I'd worked my whole life for. And Cassidy had taken it all away with one stroke of a pen, my own pen on papers I hadn't even read. Memories came flooding back. Nate on his deathbed, holding my hand with his, already growing cold. Mom, take care of them, please. About Cassidy and Lance. They'll be so lost without me. Then he turns to his wife. And you look after Mom, okay? Like she looked after me. How she honored her dying husband's last request. I didn't know how long I had been sitting on my suitcase, staring into space, when I remembered Beatrice. My old friend, a retired school nurse, lives only 15 minutes away. We've been friends for 40 years, ever since Nate and her son Tommy went to first grade. With trembling fingers, I found her number in my contacts and called. After the third ring, I heard her familiar, slightly husky voice. Muriel, are you home yet? How's the knee? B, I couldn't hold back a sob. B, I need help. There was a pause, and then, what's wrong? Her voice was instantly collected and serious. I told her everything, the words pouring out, sometimes punctuated by convulsive breaths, about the suitcase, about the note, about Cassidy and the stranger, about the changed locks and the emptied bank account. Jesus, Beatrice exhaled when I was done. Stay there, don't go anywhere. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Thank you, I whispered, feeling the tears finally break through. And Muriel, she added before hanging up, don't talk to them anymore, not a word. Do you understand? Yes. I sat on the suitcase with my eyes closed, listening to the sounds of March and Lovell. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove down the street, slowed down, probably the driver looking curiously at the elderly woman with crutches sitting on her suitcase in front of the house, and drove on. From the open window of my, no longer my, Cassidy's laughter came from the open window of my, no longer mine. Nate loved that laugh, said he'd fallen in love with it from the first sound. She laughs, and something turns me upside down inside, Mom. You know that feeling? Did I know? Maybe. Once upon a time, with Jack, in another life, before Nate, before Lovell, before this house, and definitely before Cassidy. Beatrice's silver Ford showed up exactly 10 minutes later, just like she promised. My friend was always punctual. The car pulled up to the curb and Beatrice jumped out, short, stocky, with short gray hair and a determined expression on her face. Muriel! She came quickly to me and helped me up. Come on, honey, I'll take you back to my place, and then we'll sort this out. I nodded, unable to speak. Beatrice picked up my suitcase with one hand and used the other to support me as I waddled to the car. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't want to see if Cassidy was watching us leave. It wasn't until we pulled away that I let myself cry for real, deep, desperate tears of pain and humiliation and fear. It's going to be all right, Beatrice repeated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I swear to you, Muir, we'll find a way to make it right. Beatrice's house greeted me with familiar smells: lavender, fresh baked goods, and medicine. The latter was not surprising. My friend had been a school nurse for 32 years and was accustomed to keeping a stock of everything she needed at home. Now that habit came in handy. You need to take something for the pain, Beatrice said, helping me onto the couch in the living room. Do you have a prescription? I nodded and pulled a folded sheet out of my pocket. Before I was discharged, Dr. Schumann had prescribed me a course of pills. Strong drugs. The knee was hurting like hell. I'll go to the drugstore and you get some rest. After Beatrice left, I pulled out my cell phone and looked up Lance's number. My grandson picked up after the second ring. Grandma, where are you? Mom said they took you to some senior care center. Lance, I tried to be calm, but my voice was trembling. I'm at Beatrice's. Your mother kicked me out of the house. There was my suitcase on the porch with a note. The pause on the other end of the line lengthened. I imagined Lance frowning, just like Nate in moments of confusion. But Mom said you both decided you'd be better off in a special place after the surgery. That's not true. I gripped the phone tighter. Cassidy tricked me into signing some kind of power of attorney at the hospital and took almost all of my money. I told him about the man I'd seen in the house, and Lance confirmed my fears. Fletch Doggart, a friend of his mother's whom she'd met a few months ago. A few months! I didn't even know he existed. Cassidy and I hadn't spoken much since Nate's death, 2 years in the same house and still strangers. I'd learned from talking to my grandson that Fletch had been coming to our house a lot since about Christmas. First, he and his mother met outside the house. Then he stopped by when I was away on a weekday. And a couple weeks ago, just before my surgery, he moved some of his things in. Cassidy convinced my son that I knew and approved of everything that was going on. So it was all planned in advance. Cassidy didn't just seize an opportunity, she created one. She probably expedited my surgery not out of concern, but for the sake of her plan. When Beatrice returned, I took my medicine and soon fell asleep, exhausted from the pain and shock. I awoke in the evening to muffled voices in the next room. It was dark outside the window. I must have slept for hours. The pain in my knee had dulled, but my head felt heavy from the medication. Muriel, are you all right? Beatrice peeked into the room. Better. Did you contact Gideon? Yes, he's here. Leaning on my crutches, I waddled into the kitchen, where a man in his 40s, skinny with glasses, alert brown eyes, and a neatly trimmed beard sat at the table. Mrs. Brody, he stood up and shook my hand. Gideon Mercer. Beatrice told me about your situation. I sank slowly into the chair. The lawyer opened the folder in front of him. I've checked the real estate records and bank transactions, he began. Your sister-in-law did indeed receive a power of attorney from you on March 7th, the day you were admitted to the hospital. The document was properly executed, signed by a notary public. I felt an impotent rage growing inside. All my life I'd lived modestly, saved, and all so that in my old age I could find myself penniless, thrown out of my own home. You mean the power of attorney is invalid? I asked hopefully. Gideon adjusted his glasses. It could be challenged in court, but it would be a long process. However, there is something else. Using the power of attorney, Mrs. Brody Jr. not only withdrew money from your account, but also began the process of transferring ownership of the house. What? I almost dropped the cup of tea Beatrice handed me. She can't sell my house. Not sell it, Gideon clarified. Not yet, anyway. She's filed the deed to your grandson, Lance Brody, appointing herself guardian of the property until he comes of age. I slowly set the cup on the table, feeling my hands shake. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it could be heard by everyone in the room. But how would I live? On what? Gideon frowned. Usually in cases like this, scammers would leave the victim with at least some living expenses so as not to arouse suspicion. But here, zeroing out their accounts, evicting them from their home with no alternative accommodation, it seems like they don't care about the consequences at all. Or in a hurry, Beatrice added thoughtfully, as if they had to do everything as quickly as possible. Gideon nodded and pulled a printout of Fletch's picture out of the folder. Fletcher Doggart, 47 years old, New Hampshire realtor, license suspended 2 years ago after a series of complaints, charged with fraudulent real estate sales, but the cases never went to trial. All claims were settled out of court. Fraudster, I breathed out, and Cassidy contacted him. The question is whether she knows about his past, Gideon said thoughtfully, or if she's a victim of his manipulations. I remembered the way Cassidy had looked at me through the glass of the door. Cold, calculating. No, she didn't look like a victim. She might know, I said confidently. But did? Had she helped him plan the whole thing? Gideon outlined a plan of action: to file a formal objection to the transfer of rights to the house, then file a petition to invalidate the power of attorney on the grounds that it had been obtained fraudulently. This would require my testimony about the events at the hospital and medical records confirming that I had been sedated before the operation. The money was more complicated. The power of attorney authorized Cassidy to handle my finances, and proving that she'd acted against my interests would be difficult. I need to talk to Lance, I said suddenly. He may have seen or heard something important. Beatrice and Gideon looked at each other. It's a risk, the lawyer said cautiously. He's a child, and he's likely to tell his mother about your conversation. Lance isn't a child anymore, I objected. He's 14, and he's very observant. He always has been. And he's on my side, I know. Gideon agreed, but warned me to be careful not to tell my grandson about our legal plans. The less he knew, the better for himself. The next day, Beatrice dropped me off at Lance's school. I waited for him at the fence, leaning on my crutches and peering into the stream of teenagers. When I finally saw his tall figure among his classmates, something squeezed inside. He looked so much like Nate at that age, the same dark hair, the same gait. When he saw me, Lance perked up and came quickly, looking around as if afraid someone might see us. Grandma, he hugged me gently, afraid to disturb my aching knee. How are you? We walked slowly along the school fence. I leaned heavily on my crutches, and Lance walked beside me, supporting me under his elbow. Things at home are weird, he said, his voice lowering. My mom barely talks to me, just about school and classes, and Fletch is always planning things, drawing diagrams, talking about renovations. I clenched my teeth when Lance told me that Fletch had already started destroying my garden, rooting the bushes along the fence for the future barbecue area, tearing down the garden tool shed. My garden that I'd grown for decades. Roses planted by Jack, a lilac bush from my parents' house. Lance, listen to me carefully. I stopped and looked him in the eye. I'm going to fight for our home. What your mother did is wrong and probably illegal, but I need your help. I explained that he could be my eyes and ears, watching Fletch and Cassidy, especially their conversations about the house, the deeds, the plans. But I warned him to be careful, not to eavesdrop on purpose, not to take any chances. Lance nodded and said abruptly, I already know something. I heard them talking in the kitchen last night. Fletch said they needed to speed up the process with the house because he had an interested party. I frowned. An interested party? A buyer? He also asked Mom if she was sure you wouldn't come back and cause problems. Lance continued. And Mom said that everything was under control, that you had signed all the necessary papers. Lance added that Fletch had already moved into their house. All his stuff is there, and he's sleeping in Cassidy's room, the bedroom where she and Nate used to be. This news shouldn't have surprised me. Of course they sleep together. And yet to imagine another man in my son's bedroom. The pain of that thought was sharp and deep. Lance, I looked into his eyes. I know this is hard for you, and I don't want to put you between me and your mother. If you feel like you can't or won't help me, I understand. No, he said firmly. I want to help. What they're doing is wrong, and it's not just you, Grandma. He sighed. This Fletch, he's not who he says he is. Sometimes he's too perfect. Tells Mom exactly what she wants to hear, and when he thinks no one can see, he's different. Cold, smart boy, observant, like Nate at his age. I asked him to be careful, not to show his suspicions, and to call me or Beatrice if he noticed anything strange or felt threatened. Walking back to Beatrice's car, I pondered Lance's words. An interested party. Speeding up the process. What are Cassidy and this Fletch guy up to? And how far are they willing to go? As I waddled down the sidewalk, my thoughts jumbled. The events of the last 2 days seemed like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, but the pain in my knee, the weight of the crutches, the cold March wind, it was all too real. In Beatrice's car, I told her and Gideon, who was waiting for us, about the conversation with Lance. The lawyer wrote down the information, particularly interested in the mention of interested party. Maybe they already have a buyer for the house, he suggested. That would explain the rush. The sooner they reissue the paperwork, the sooner they can sell the property. But they can't sell the house without my consent, I objected. Not even with a power of attorney. Gideon shook his head. If they can get it transferred to Lance with Cassidy as guardian, she'll have full authority over the property. We need to act fast. Looking out the window at the familiar streets of Lovell floating by, I thought about Nate. What would he say when he found out what his widow had done to his mother? How had she honored his last request to take care of me? I spent 3 days at Beatrice's house trying to adjust to my new reality. My friend did everything she could to make me comfortable, cooked my favorite meals, helped me with the knee exercises Dr. Schumann recommended, even moved the curtains in the guest bedroom to keep the sun out of my eyes in the morning. But despite all her care, I felt lost. Beatrice's house, though cozy, remained alien. Every night I was haunted by the same dreams. I was coming home, but I couldn't get in. The doors are locked, the windows are covered with cobwebs, and strangers are laughing inside. I would wake up in a cold sweat, disoriented, with a pulling pain in my operated knee. On the fourth day, as Beatrice and I were having our morning coffee, it suddenly hit me. The box! I almost dropped the cup. How could I have forgotten about the box? What box? Beatrice frowned. In the basement of our house, under the old staircase. I set the cup on the table. Jack always kept important documents there. After he died, I continued the tradition. There should be the original deeds to the house, Nate's will, insurance policies, everything. Beatrice perked up. And you don't think Cassidy knows about it? Pretty sure. She never went down to the basement, said it was damp and smelled musty. And the box is well hidden behind some old suitcases. I reached for the phone. I should call Gideon. The lawyer arrived an hour later. After listening to my story about the stash, he tapped his pen thoughtfully on his notebook. If the original deeds to the house and Nate's will are in there, it could really help our case, he said. But the question is how to get them. I need to get into the house. I straightened up as much as my bad knee would allow. When Cassidy and Fletch aren't around. It's risky. Beatrice shook her head. If they caught you trespassing, it would only make things worse. Technically, it's not trespassing, Gideon objected. Mrs. Brody still owns the house, but the police would have to prove that if Cassidy called the police. I knew they were right, but I felt we had no chance without the papers. We had to find a way to get into the house without being seen. Lance, I said suddenly. He might be able to help. Gideon raised an eyebrow skeptically. You want to involve a 14-year-old in a potentially dangerous situation? Not a dangerous one. I shook my head. He could just tell me when Cassidy and Fletch are leaving the house, or even let me in when they're gone. After much discussion, we did come up with a plan. I called Lance and, trying to be allegorical in case Cassidy was around, asked about his schedule for the next few days. His grandson quickly realized what I was talking about and informed me that tomorrow, Friday, his mother and Fletch were going to some business dinner in Boston. They would leave around 5 o'clock and be back late, 11 o'clock at the earliest. Perfect, Gideon said when I gave him the information. We'll go there together as soon as we're sure they're really gone. The next day stretched agonizingly slowly. I couldn't find a place to be with excitement, constantly checking my phone, waiting for messages from Lance. Finally, at the beginning of the 6th, came a short, "They're gone. You can come over." Beatrice stayed home. Someone had to stay in touch if anything went wrong. Gideon got behind the wheel of his silver Volvo, and we drove to my house. I grew more and more nervous on the way. What if Cassidy and Fletch changed their minds and came back early? What if the box wasn't there anymore? What if it was all for nothing? It was starting to get dark when we pulled up to the house. I stared painfully at the familiar outline white walls, dark blue shutters, a small porch with 2 steps. The once manicured garden looked neglected. Fletch had already uprooted the rose bushes along the fence, leaving only bare earth and holes. Lance was waiting for us at the side entrance, looking around nervously. "Grandma," he hugged me. "Are you sure you want to do this?" "I'm sure," I nodded. "Lance, this is our only chance to get the house back." Gideon urged us on. "The sooner we find the documents, the better. There may be less time than we think." The grandson led us through the kitchen. I was painfully aware of the changes: new dishes on the shelves, unfamiliar kitchen appliances, a framed picture of Cassidy and Fletch on the wall. It was as if I'd never been in this house. "This way." I pointed to the door leading to the basement. "Be careful, the stairs are steep." Walking down the stairs with my bad knee was torture. Gideon supported me under his elbow, and Lance walked ahead of me with a flashlight on his phone. When we were finally downstairs, I looked around. The basement looked pretty much as I remembered it: cool, damp-smelling, and old stuff. Most of the space was filled with boxes of seasonal decorations, old furniture that Jack and I had never thrown away, and suitcases, lots of suitcases, a memory from when we were still traveling. "Over there." I pointed to the far corner, behind the blue suitcase. Lance reached between the boxes and pushed aside the old blue suitcase. Behind it, I could see a protective colored metal box, and army box from Jack's time. I exhaled a sigh of relief. At least it was still there. "Found it." Lance pulled the box out and set it on an old table against the wall. I walked over, leaning on my crutches, and ran my hand over the dusty lid. How many years had it been since I'd last opened it? 2? 3? There was no lock on the box, just a tight-fitting lid with a worn documents label. "Open it," I asked Gideon, whose hands were not shaking, unlike mine. The lawyer carefully lifted the lid. Inside were folders and envelopes, neatly categorized. I lowered myself down onto the chair Lance had thoughtfully pulled up and began to look through the contents. "Here." I pulled out a thick yellow folder labeled House. It should have all the deeds to the property. Gideon opened the folder and started looking through the papers quickly. "Great," he said, after looking through a few pages. "There's the original certificate of ownership, the purchase agreement, the land deeds, everything we need." I pulled out a thinner folder labeled Nate Next. "And this should be his will." My voice shook. Opening that folder was physically painful, like tearing open a barely healed wound. Gideon delicately took the folder from my hands and opened it himself. After flipping through a few pages, he stopped. "Here it is," he said. "Nathan Brody's will, notarized." He ran his eyes over the document. Yes, it clearly stated that the house was to remain in Muriel Brody's possession until her death, after which it would pass in equal shares to Cassidy and Lance Brody. I closed my eyes. Nate had taken care of me even after he died. He knew how important this house was to me, how many memories were tied to it. "Found something else." Lance's voice broke me from my thoughts. My grandson was holding a thick envelope at the bottom of the drawer. It said, "Nate's Insurance." I frowned. The insurance payments from my son's death had been transferred to Cassidy over a year ago. What else could be in this envelope? Lance held the envelope out to me. I opened it and pulled out the papers. As I ran my eyes over the first few lines, I felt my breath catch. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "Nate changed the beneficiary of the insurance policy shortly before he died," I said, hardly believing my eyes. He'd opened a supplemental death policy that listed me as the primary beneficiary. Here, I turned the page. Almost $150,000. "But why didn't you ever get that money?" Gideon wondered. "I didn't know about the policy." I shook my head. "Nate must have taken it out in secret." "Did Cassidy know?" Lance asked quietly. I shrugged. I wasn't sure, but since the money was still unclaimed, maybe not. Gideon took out his phone and took some pictures of the documents. This is a very important find, he said. With these papers, we can not only challenge Cassidy's actions, but also provide you with financial stability for the future. As we talked, Lance continued to rummage through the drawer. Grandma, he called out suddenly. What's this? He was holding a shabby folder with the logo of some bank. I'd never seen it before. I have no idea, I answered honestly. Why is it here? Gideon took the folder and opened it. As he looked through the contents, his face became more and more tense. What is it? I asked. Frank Darrell's papers, the lawyer said slowly. Driver's license, insurance certificate, bank statements, and a photograph. He showed me the picture, and I recognized the man in it immediately, Fletch. Except his hair was shorter and he looked a little younger. Frank Durrell? I asked him again. But his name is Fletch Doggart. I guess not. Gideon continued to study the documents. There's something else here. Newspaper clippings. He unfolded the yellowed pages. Scammer defrauded elderly couple of $200,000. One headline read. Scammer specializing in the elderly escaped justice again, screamed another. The man in the photos was still the same man, Fletch, or now Frank. Jesus, I exhaled. He's a serial crook, and Cassidy contacted him. Or he targeted her, Gideon pointed out. A widow with a child inheriting a house. Perfect target. But why were these documents in our basement? I wondered. Lance looked thoughtful. I think I know, he said quietly. A week ago, Fletch brought a suitcase into the house. Not an ordinary one, but a metal one. Locked it in his room, the former guest room. But then I saw him go down to the basement with some papers. Probably decided to hide some of the papers separately from the suitcase. And he chose the least suspicious place, the drawer with the family papers. Gideon nodded. Smart. Who would look for something suspicious among insurance policies and birth certificates? What are we going to do with this? I asked, pointing to the folder with Frank Durrell's papers. Gideon thought for a moment. First, I'll make copies of everything, he said, pulling out his cell phone. Then I'll contact the police. If this man really is wanted for fraud in several states, they should know. We spent another hour or so in the basement, carefully going through every document in the drawer and taking pictures of everything important. Gideon put the most important papers, Nate's will, the house papers, the insurance policy, and the Frank Fletch file, into his briefcase. We returned the rest to the box and put it back in its original place, behind the blue suitcase. Now we have to leave, the lawyer said, looking at his watch. It was 8 o'clock, and although Lance said they wouldn't be back until 11, it wasn't worth the risk. We said goodbye to Lance, and I left my house with a heavy heart. Even though I knew I could come back soon, it hurt to leave. On the drive back to Beatrice's, Gideon was unusually silent. He drove the car with concentration, occasionally glancing at his briefcase with documents. What are you thinking about? I finally asked. That we're incredibly lucky, he answered. These documents won't just help you get your house back, they could put Fletch or Frank behind bars for years to come. The question is whether Cassidy knew his real identity. If she did, she's an accessory, I said. Yes, Gideon nodded. And in that case, she could face prosecution too. The thought of my grandson's mother going to jail was a heavy one. Despite everything Cassidy had done, she was still Lance's mother. What would happen to the boy if she ended up behind bars? When we got back to Beatrice's house, she was waiting for us with a hot dinner. Gideon briefly told her about our findings, showed her pictures of the documents. I'll go to the police first thing in the morning, he said. Then I'll file an urgent petition with the court to stop any dealings with your house, Mrs. Brody. We're in a strong position with these documents. He promised to call as soon as there was news and left. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in many days, without nightmares or awakenings. In the morning, Beatrice and I waited tensely for a call from Gideon. He called around 11. "I've just come from the police station," he reported. They confirmed that Frank Darrell is indeed wanted in 3 states for fraud against the elderly. A warrant is now being prepared for his arrest. The police have already set up surveillance on your house. What about the motion to the court? I asked. It's been filed, Gideon replied. Given the circumstances of the case, the judge promised to expedite it. Maybe tomorrow we'll get a temporary restraining order against the house. I felt a heavy weight fall from my shoulders. For the first time in days, there was real hope. "Thank you, Gideon," I said, "for everything." "You're welcome," he said. "Just doing my job." "I'm ready," I said firmly. They wouldn't take me by surprise again. The morning of the court day started for me long before dawn. I woke up at 4 in the morning with a pain in my knee and couldn't sleep again. I lay staring up at the ceiling of Beatrice's guest bedroom and mentally replayed the day ahead over and over again. My nerves were taut as a string. By 8 o'clock, I'd showered, drank a cup of strong tea, and put on my navy blue suit that I hadn't pulled out since Nate's funeral. The suit hung looser on me than it had before. I'd lost a few pounds in the last few weeks. Beatrice insisted that I at least try to eat breakfast, but I couldn't eat a bite. "You'll be fine," she said as she helped me fix my hair. "You have irrefutable proof." I nodded, but my insides were tight with fear. What if the judge didn't believe me? What if Cassidy and Fletch got away with it? What would happen to Lance? Gideon arrived at 9 sharp, trim, and collected, carrying a leather briefcase full of papers. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Brody?" he asked as he helped me into the car. "Honestly, I'm terrified," I replied, gripping my cane tighter. My knee hurt, but I'd decided not to use crutches today. I didn't want to look too weak in front of the court. "That's okay," he nodded. "But believe me, we have a very strong case." I stared at the familiar streets of Lovell as I drove, thinking about Nate. What would he say when he found out what his widow had done to his mother? How she had betrayed his trust and his last request? The courthouse appeared in the distance, an imposing 3-story red brick structure with columns. My heart beat faster. My temples were pounding. Today, everything would be decided. Today, everything would be decided. There was a surprise waiting for us in the courthouse lobby. Lance. He was sitting on a bench, nervously rubbing the strap of his backpack. When he saw us, he rushed toward us and hugged me tightly. "Grandma, I knew you'd be here early." "Lance, what are you doing here?" I stroked his back, feeling his hands trembling. "Shouldn't you be at school?" I told him I wasn't feeling well. He pulled away, looking at me with serious eyes that looked so much like Nate's. "I want to be here. I want to tell the truth." Cassidy and Fletch showed up at 10 sharp, accompanied by their lawyer, a tall man with balding hair and a tenacious gaze. Cassidy froze in place when she saw Lance, her face contorted with a mixture of surprise and anger. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, heading toward us. "You're supposed to be at school." Gideon stepped between her and Lance. "Mrs. Brody, please take your seat. The trial is about to begin." Before Cassidy could answer, there was a clang of the gavel, and the judge, a woman in her 60s with short gray hair and attentive eyes behind her glasses, entered the courtroom. The first half hour of the session passed in formality. The lawyers introduced themselves and gave their versions of events. Gideon was clear and to the point. How I'd been tricked into signing a power of attorney at the hospital. How Cassidy had used it to withdraw money and try to remortgage the house. How I'd been forced out of my own home. Cassidy's attorney, Richard Fulton, presented a completely different picture. that I, in my right mind, had signed the power of attorney for my sister-in-law, and that I had left the house voluntarily, realizing that I would be a burden after the surgery. Listening to these lies, I clutched the handle of my cane until it hurt. Then it was time to testify. I rose slowly and made my way to the witness stand, trying not to limp too visibly. In response to Gideon's questions, I told it like it was, the papers Cassidy had brought to the hospital, calling them insurance forms, how disoriented I'd been after the pre-surgery medication, coming home and finding my suitcase on the porch. "What did you feel in that moment?" Gideon asked. "Shock, disbelief." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I couldn't believe that the woman my son loved so much, the woman he trusted with his life and his child's future, could do this to me. Fulton's cross-examination was painful. He insinuated that I was beginning to suffer from senile dementia, that I had simply forgotten my decision to turn over financial management to my daughter-in-law. "My memory is perfectly fine, Mr. Fulton," I replied, looking him straight in the eye. "And I would never, under any circumstances, agree to give up everything I have and end up on the street." Next came the bank expert, who presented to the court the results of the examination of signatures. "The signatures on the power of attorney and on the subsequent bank documents are significantly different," he explained, pointing to the projected images. "Moreover, on 3 pages, there are signs that the signature was copied and transferred using computer technology." The judge scrutinized the images, making notes. I saw Cassidy turn pale and whisper something in Fletch's ear. He just waved it away, his face impassive. It was Lance's turn. My grandson held himself with surprising dignity for a 14-year-old. He told me how Fletch had come into their lives a few months ago, how he'd gradually started living in the house, planning renovations and changes. "A few days ago, I overheard them talking in the kitchen," Lance continued. "They thought I was asleep. Fletch said they needed to speed up the process of remortgaging the house because he had an interested party and mentioned the amount, over $300,000. After the sale, they planned to move to Arizona." "What about you?" Gideon asked. "Were you supposed to go with them?" "No." Lance lowered his gaze. "They were talking about boarding school." A whisper swept through the room. Cassidy jumped up from his seat. "That's a lie," she shouted. "Lance, how can you say that?" "Silence." The judge banged her gavel. "Mrs. Brody, sit down immediately." The hearing culminated when Gideon presented the court with the documents found in the basement. First, Nate's will, clearly stating that I was to own the house for the rest of my life. Then, an insurance policy that made me the beneficiary of a large sum of money. And finally, Frank Darrell's name and newspaper clippings about his scams against the elderly. "Your Honor," Gideon pointed to Fletch, "this man is not Fletcher Doggart, but Frank Darrell, wanted for a series of frauds in 3 states. He purposely defrauded Mrs. Cassidy Brody in order to use her to gain access to Muriel Brody's estate." There was a commotion in the hall. Fletch jumped up from his seat, his face contorted with rage. "This is slander. You have no proof." At that moment, the doors of the hall opened and 2 uniformed policemen entered. One of them approached the judge and said something quietly to her. She nodded and called a recess. The cops walked straight toward Fletch, one of them pulling out handcuffs. "Frank Darrell, you are under arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and evading justice." Fletch tried to break free, but the second officer grabbed his arm tightly. Cassidy looked on with an expression of utter shock. "Fletch?" Her voice shook. "What's going on?" He threw a furious glare at her. "Shut up, you fool! Nothing would have happened if you'd done the right thing." As Fletch was being escorted out of the hall, a third officer approached Cassidy. "Cassidy Brody, You need to come down to the station with us for a statement. Yeah, I didn't know anything. She looked confused. I thought his name was Fletch. You can explain that at the station, ma'am. Cassidy threw a desperate look at Lance. Lance, honey, I'll be right back. It's gonna be okay. I promise. My grandson looked at her with an expression that broke my heart, a mixture of disappointment, pain, and pity. After a short recess, Judge Hampton returned to the courtroom. Her ruling was swift and unequivocal. The fraudulently obtained power of attorney is declared null and void. All transactions made pursuant to it are void. The bank was ordered to return all withdrawals to me. The house was officially still in my possession under Nate's will. As to the criminal charges against Frank Darrell and Cassidy Brody's possible involvement in his fraudulent scheme, the judge concluded, those matters will be handled in a separate criminal case. The bang of the gavel sounded like a final chord. I felt tears of relief run down my cheeks. Beatrice hugged me tightly, and Gideon shook my hand, congratulating me on my victory. But the real thrill was when Lance came up to me. His eyes were red. He'd been crying too. Grandma, he hugged me so tightly that I almost lost my balance. We won. Yes, honey. I stroked his back. We won. What's gonna happen to Mom? He asked quietly. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to give him false hope, but I didn't want to traumatize him more. A lot depends on whether she knew who Fletch really was, I said finally. If she'd been the victim of her own deception, the court might be lenient. We walked out of the courthouse into the drizzling rain. Beatrice offered to drive us home, my house, which was officially mine again. But I shook my head. Not today. Let the police finish their investigation. Besides, there might be journalists there. Instead, we went back to Beatrice's. I felt strangely empty. For the last few weeks, I had lived with only one goal, to get my house back and to punish those who had cheated me. Now that it had happened, I didn't know how to feel. That evening, when Lance was already asleep in Beatrice's son's room, the phone rang. It was Gideon. Mrs. Brody, I have news. Cassidy's been arrested. She's being charged with accessory to fraud. Arrested? I'm slumped in my chair. Are you sure? Yes. A search of the house turned up additional evidence. Looks like she knew a lot more about Daryl's real identity than she was pretending. I closed my eyes. What's gonna happen to Lance now? His mom's in jail. His pseudo-stepdad turned out to be a crook. What would happen next? I asked. Tomorrow morning, I'll file for temporary custody of Lance for you, Gideon answered. Given the circumstances, I think the court will decide quickly. After the conversation, I sat in Beatrice's kitchen for a long time, looking out the window at the dark street. Today, I had gotten everything I'd been looking for: a house, money, justice. Those who deceived me have been arrested, but victory left a bitter taste. I thought about Nate, about his last request to take care of Cassidy and Lance. I hadn't been able to keep Cassidy from her own decisions, but Lance needed me now more than ever. I won't let you down again, son, I whispered, as if Nate could hear me. I swear I'll take care of your boy. I woke up in the morning with renewed determination. Yes, things hadn't worked out the way I'd envisioned, but I had a home again, I had money, and most importantly, I had Lance. Now we had to learn to move on with our lives, despite all the scars and losses. For a week after the trial, I couldn't bring myself to go home. I continued to live at Beatrice's, even though legally the Maple Street house was once again all mine. The keys handed over by the police were on my bedside table, but every time I looked at them, something clenched inside. The house I'd fought so desperately for was suddenly scaring me. Gideon arranged temporary guardianship of Lance for me. The process had gone surprisingly smoothly. After Cassidy's arrest and all the circumstances of the case had been cleared up, the court saw no reason to deny it. Now my grandson lived in Beatrice's son's room, went to school, and came home quiet, brooding, eyes red from sleep. "When are we going home?" he asked one morning at breakfast. "To our house?" I looked away, not knowing what to say. Our house. But was it still ours? The place where Nate and Lance had grown up? Where we'd celebrated birthdays and Christmas? Where we'd kept our memories? Soon, I answered uncertainly, as soon as everything settled down, but I couldn't put it off any longer. At the end of the week, Beatrice delicately reminded me that while she was happy to host us, her house was not a rubber house, and Lance and I deserved to return to our own place. Saturday morning, we loaded our few belongings into Beatrice's car. She insisted on driving us and helping us settle in. All the way there, I sat with my hands clenched, and Lance was silent, staring out the window. The weather was clear, the first real warmth of April, but I felt damp and dank. When we pulled up to the house, I held my breath. It looked almost exactly as I remembered it. White walls, dark blue shutters, a small garden in front of the porch. Only the garden was disfigured. The rose bushes had been uprooted, the flower beds dug up, the patch of ground by the fence a muddy patch of sticking boards, the beginning of Fletch's unfinished barbecue area. "Here we are," Beatrice said with feigned cheerfulness as she pulled the car to a stop. I nodded, unable to say a word. Lance was the first to jump out of the car and head for the door, as if he couldn't wait to get inside. I followed him slowly, leaning on my cane. My knees still hurt, but not so much. The physical therapy Dr. Schumann had insisted on was helping. The lock clicked into place. A familiar odor wood, lavender, old books stripped his nostrils, but it was laced with something foreign. Fletch's cologne? The new cleaning products Cassidy was using? I couldn't tell, but the odor made the house seem less mine. Inside, everything looked different than I remembered. Furniture rearranged, my things put away, new knickknacks on the shelves. There was an unfamiliar couch in the living room. Leather, brown, not my taste at all. My old chair had disappeared without a trace. "They've changed a lot of things," Beatrice commented, looking around. "But that's all right. You'll gradually get it back to the way it was." Lance walked silently up the stairs to the second floor, and I heard the door of his room slam. I wanted to follow him, to hug him, to tell him everything would be all right, but I knew he wouldn't believe me. I didn't believe it myself. Instead, I walked slowly around the first floor, touching familiar walls, studying the changes. There was a shiny new coffee maker in the kitchen. In the dining room, there was a different table, a glass table, cold, not at all like my old wooden one, where 2 generations of our family had grown up. "Tea?" Beatrice suggested, taking the initiative. "I'll put the kettle on and you sit down. You look exhausted." I sank into the chair, suddenly feeling the weight of the past weeks. Exhausted? No, I was completely drained. It was as if someone had scraped away everything inside, leaving only a shell. While Beatrice rattled cups in the kitchen, I thought about what had happened after the trial. Things were moving fast. Cassidy and Fletch, Frank Darrell to be exact, had been arrested right in the courtroom. The police searched the house and found further evidence of their machinations: forged documents, fake IDs, lists of potential victims. It turned out that Darrell was wanted not only for fraud, but also for identity theft in 3 states. 2 days after his arrest, Gideon informed me that Cassidy had agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She admitted that she knew of Fletch's criminal history and had volunteered to participate in his scheme. She said they met at a coffee shop almost a year ago, and he charmed her with promises of a better life. 2 years, Gideon said by phone. She got 2 years with the possibility of parole in 12 months with good behavior. And Fletch? I asked. Frank Darrell got 12 years. He had a long list of previous offenses, and this time the judge decided to teach him a lesson. I nodded, though Gideon couldn't see it through the phone. 12 years. Enough time for Lance to grow up, graduate high school, go to college. Cassidy would be out sooner, but even 2 years was an infinity for a teenager who was suddenly motherless. Walking up to the second floor, I knocked quietly on the door of his room. Lance, may I come in? Silence, then a muffled, yes. The room looked almost exactly as it had before. Teenage clutter, posters on the walls, books and textbooks strewn across the desk. Lance sat on the bed, hunched over, phone in hand. I tried to call my mom, he said without looking at me. But there's some kind of answering machine. Says the inmates can only take calls at certain hours. I cautiously sat down next to him, leaving a small space between us. Yes, prisons have strict rules about phone calls, I said softly, but I'm sure you'll be able to talk to her soon. Lance looked up at me, his eyes full of pain and questions. Why did she do it, Grandma? Why contact him? Why did she deceive you? I took a deep breath. How do you explain to a child that adults sometimes do terrible things? That love and despair can push you into crime? I think she was lost after your father died, I said carefully. Lonely, frightened of the future. Fletch showed up and offered a solution to all her problems. She believed him, and when she realized what she'd gotten herself into, it was too late to back out. But she had to know it was wrong, Lance insisted. Kicking you out of the house, stealing your money. Yes, she should have. I wasn't going to make excuses for Cassidy. And she'll answer for what she did. But she's still your mother, Lance, and she loves you no matter what. He turned away, staring out the window. She wanted to send me to boarding school. I heard them talking. Maybe she thought it would be better for you. I couldn't believe my own words, but I tried to soften the blow. Or maybe Fletch convinced her of that. Lance shook his head. Don't defend her, Grandma. I know what you're trying to do, but don't. We'll get through this, I said, gently putting my arm around his shoulders. Day by day, together. He didn't pull away, but he didn't snuggle into me like he had before. There was an invisible wall between us, not of resentment or anger, but of pain, loss, and uncertainty. In the evening, when Beatrice left and Lance went up to his room, I found I didn't know what to do. I used to like to read in my chair in the evenings, but the chair was gone. Fletch had replaced the TV with a huge plasma screen that made my eyes blurry. I decided to go out into the garden. The air was cool but pleasant. The stars twinkled over Lovell, reminding me of the evenings Nate and I would sit on the back porch and make up new names for the constellations. Later, he'd do the same with little Lance. The garden looked neglected. Fletch had managed to do considerable damage, but hadn't finished his improvements. Some of my perennials remained intact, and I noticed that the first spring flowers were already pushing through the ground. Crocuses, tulips, daffodils. Everything was as it always is, despite the chaos around me. In the far corner of the garden was an old bench that Fletch had luckily not thrown away. I sat down on it, looking up at the house, where the windows were lit. The lights were dimmed in Lance's room, probably watching something on his computer. My bedroom was gaping darkness. I hadn't dared go in there yet, knowing Cassidy and Fletch had used it in my absence. Family is everything, Nate had said. And even though our family was now only a shadow of what my son envisioned, I vowed to keep what was left of it. For Nate, for Lance, and finally, for myself. The house didn't seem empty anymore. It was filled with memories good and bad, but also with hope. Hope for healing, for a new beginning. Not today or tomorrow, but someday.